So I was supposed to give a different speech this morning. But on Shabbat morning yesterday, I woke up to the news, to a group text from my youngest sister, that my community, the Pittsburgh Jewish community, appeared to be the site of a horrific killing. The ADL has now called it the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in American history. So I hope you'll forgive me for changing subjects and for bearing with me if this is a little bit hard to do. I spent yesterday talking to my family and to beloved mentors and rabbis as I tried to capture what makes our particular Jewish community in Pittsburgh so very special for the readers of the New York Times. I wanted to articulate why I am so proud to be a daughter of Squirrel Hill, and why I think that our community in particular exemplifies the most sacred Jewish values. So let me begin there, in Squirrel Hill. Down the block from my house, on the morning of March 15th, 1997, the Shabbat during which I became a bat mitzvah at Tree of Life Synagogue in Squirrel Hill. I wasn't supposed to be there, but the previous October, a fire had blazed through my family's regular Saturday synagogue, Beth Shalom, less than a mile away. Now, anyone who is from Squirrel Hill or has been lucky to spend time there won't be surprised to learn how the community responded to the disaster. Jews and Gentiles alike ran toward the fire. As Beth Shalom's executive director told a reporter at the time, I didn't have to look. Everyone came to me. The line put me in mind of my favorite of Fred Rogers' sayings. He said, "When I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, 'Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping.'" Squirrel Hill was Mr. Rogers' real-world neighborhood. He lived 3 blocks from the synagogue, and it is full of helpers. While my family went to shul at Tree of Life for many years, none, thankfully, were there this Shabbat morning when Robert Bowers, a 46-year-old man motivated by his hatred of our people, began gunning people down while screaming, "All Jews must die." But 11 of our neighbors were killed. We have their names, and they are Joyce Feinberg, Rich Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil and David Rosenthal, who are brothers, Bernice Simon and Sylvan Simon, who are a married couple, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, and Irving Younger. All of them were older or special needs, the weakest people in any community. And one of them, Dr. Jerry Rabinowitz, had gotten out of the disaster, but he's a doctor and he ran back in to save lives, and that's when he was killed. My grandparents, my parents, my sisters, my aunt and uncles, and me, we will attend several funerals this week. That's because Squirrel Hill functions like an urban shtetl. In most American cities, as all of you know, Jews tend to live in the suburbs. But not so in Pittsburgh, where more than half of the Jewish community still lives in the city, mainly in Squirrel Hill. And unlike giant urban centers like New York or Los Angeles, Pittsburgh's Jewish community is small enough that we don't stay in our religious or political lanes. When I spoke last week at my grandparents' Reform synagogue, there were liberal and conservative, Reform and Orthodox, Israeli and American-born Jews who waited to hug me and argue with me afterward. That's Pittsburgh. There's a phrase in the Talmud that has always felt especially relevant to my community. Kol Yisrael Aravim ze bazeh. All of Israel is responsible for one another. I'm sure most of you know it. But for my community, that's not a theory. It is a lived reality. Because I come from such a community that embodies this phrase, I have always been stumped when I'm asked to fill out surveys to describe what kind of Jew I am. My family paid dues at a Reform, a conservative, and an Orthodox shul. And while I'm definitely not an Orthodox Jew, I never felt comfortable checking any of the other boxes. So I always check just Jewish, which feels the most accurate, but is also sort of lame. But the man who started the grassroots movement to save Soviet Jewry, Yaakov Birnbaum, had a better name for it, for the kind of Jew that I aspire to be. He called himself a Klal Yisrael Jew, a Jew who identifies with the whole community, with the fate of each and every one of us, in every corner under heaven. Would that we all thought of ourselves that way, as identifying with the whole of our people. What would we look like? What would the Jewish world look like? And what about the broader world? In Pittsburgh, the spirit of looking out for the klal, for the community, is not just a Jewish act. I was so moved by a story shared by an Orthodox rabbi, Rabbi Wasserman, who also runs the Jewish Burial Society in my hometown. He said that on Shabbat afternoon, as he stood outside of his shul, Sharei Torah, he was approached by a student who said his name was Ahmed. Ahmed held a large serving bowl of hot soup in his hands, and he handed Rabbi Wasserman a note that said the following: "I'm a student at Carnegie Mellon University. I've lived in Squirrel Hill for almost 4 years now, and I'm very grateful for the hospitality and how good everyone here has been to me. I tried to make something for you. I'm sorry for your loss, and I wanted to give my condolences to your community. Please accept this. I didn't put any dairy or eggs or anything not kosher in the lentils. My thoughts and prayers go out to the bereaved. Love, Ahmed." Ahmed is also Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is a community that keeps its doors open, figuratively, but also literally. As with the vast majority of shuls across this country, the doors to Tree of Life and of Pittsburgh's other synagogues yesterday morning didn't have any security, and they were open to all comers. We live according to our values, the values that Robert Bowers, the alleged killer, appears to despise. One of the shooter's obsessions, as I'm sure you all know, was HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, a Jewish organization originally founded in the late 1800s to resettle the Jews fleeing the pogroms of Eastern Europe. Today, it rescues Jews and non-Jews alike facing persecution all over the world. It does righteous work. A few weeks ago, Bauer shared a link to an event called Refugee Shabbat, a national initiative organized by HIAS, of which Tree of Life was a participating synagogue. "Why, hello there, HIAS," he wrote. "You like to bring in hostile invaders to dwell among us," he wrote on a social networking site used by alt-right activists and white nationalists. Just yesterday morning, he posted, "HIAS likes to bring in invaders that kill our people. I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered. Screw your optics, I'm going in." Now, the heartbreaking coincidence is that the Jewish emphasis on the open door, on welcoming the stranger, is exactly what the Jews of Tree of Life and the Jews of every synagogue, big and small, including right here at the Biltmore, were reading about on this Shabbat morning. We are reading from Genesis, from Parshat Vayera. The Parsha opens on one of the most famous scenes in the entire Torah. Judaism's founding father and mother, Abraham and Sarah, are in their tent when 3 men, strangers, show up unannounced. The couple welcomes them, feeding them, giving them shade, and washing their feet. For those of you who know the story well, you will know that Abraham was in the middle of a conversation with God when those strangers show up. And he chooses to interrupt that conversation and welcome them in. So important, the lesson we are taught, is the value of hachnasat orchim, of welcoming guests, more important even than a personal conversation with God. Well, it's a good thing he does, because those strangers come with a shocking message, one that will change the course of Jewish history. Sarah, then at the ripe age of 90, they tell her, will bear a child. Sarah laughs famously and incredulously, but she soon gives birth to Isaac. And the strangers, the tradition teaches us, are not strangers at all, but angels in disguise. The tent, the open tent, is the foundational Jewish structure. Other people in other religions have towering cathedrals. We have the tent. And I've always felt that the tent is the perfect reflection of what Judaism cares about. Everything physical in this world, our bodies, this building, everything is transitory. We live in a mainstream culture that makes us forget that, with its obsession on materialism and youth and bling. But you cannot escape the impermanence of the tent. Tents advertise that they are transitory, just as we are. Tents can be taken down in minutes, but other things in life are eternal. What is eternal? Not our physical homes, but our spiritual ones. What is eternal are our ideas and our values. What matters, in other words, is what goes on inside the tent, between all of us, sitting there, talking, welcoming the stranger, strangers that can transform our lives. There's a reason that every Jewish couple gets married under a canopy that is open on all four sides, a replica of Abraham and Sarah's tent. It is our wish for every couple that they will embody the values of our original father and mother, because those are the true source of our longevity and our resilience. Just imagine for a moment that that original tent, Abraham and Sarah's, had been closed to the world. Would Isaac have ever been born at all? Would there even be a Jewish people? As we understandably have feelings about closing off and hunkering down and turning away from the world, this is what we must remember. Now, that scene is not the only one from this week's Parsha that's deeply relevant to this raw and painful moment. In the very next verses, we have the story of Sodom and Amorah. God, of course, is set on destroying these cities, cities of sin, in which barely a righteous person can be found. Avraham is horrified by this plan, because righteous people, innocents, are going to be killed too. Will the judge of the entire earth not perform justice, he says to God? Spare the city, he insists. Spare the city. And he goes on to argue with God. Now, the chutzpah here is truly amazing. To me, it is not in the act of circumcising himself when Avraham becomes the first Jew. It is in this moment. It is in the audacity to argue with God, to call God to account, to act according to God's own standards. Deborah Lipstadt, one of my favorite non-rabbinic rebbes, had a profound thought about this scene, which she shared with me last night. Not only is this moment transformative for Avraham, she suggests, but it is transformative for God. It is the moment where God realizes, I chose the right person to be the founder of Am Yisrael. I chose a person who calls me to account, a person obsessed with justice and with right and with goodness, a person concerned with his neighbors, a person who has the audacity to tell the truth to any power, to any king, even the King of Kings. Now, finally, the Parsha ends with the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, the most disturbing and problematic story in the entire Torah. To be honest, I plan to skip over it entirely. It makes me so uncomfortable. But I talked very late last night to my friend, Rabbi David Wolpe, who offered the most simple and radical explanation of the Akedah that I have ever heard. He said this: what the Akedah tells us is that human sacrifice is not permitted. Avraham was born into a world where people worshipped idols and practiced sacrifice. Avraham was willing to follow God and do what the rest of the world in his time would have done, but God stopped him. The ultimate lesson of this disturbing story is that sacrifice is not sacred. Survival is sacred. Living is sacred. I call heaven and earth to witness you this day. I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse, and therefore choose life. Choose life. That's what that video was about, and that is Judaism's core value. So how are we to live in the wake of this horrific tragedy that is occurring during what I think we would all agree, regardless of our politics, is the most deeply divided, raw, and scary time in recent American memory? After we bury our fellow Jews in Pittsburgh, how are we going to choose and affirm life? I want to talk first about the political response and then about the Jewish response. Now, I know you like to avoid politics here at JNF, but I hope you'll permit me a few words that I think are essential this morning. I do not need to tell anyone in this room that we are living in an age in which anti-Semitism is on the rise here at home, on the left and on the right. On the right and on the left, we are seeing the rise of Manichaean thinking, tribal, black and white, unnuanced logic, in which groups are divided into evil and good, black and white, in and out. There are new caste systems on both sides of the political divide, and we Jews have no place in either. On the right, there is a caste system in which white men are at the top of the pecking order, the only true heirs to America and to Western civilization. But on the far left, that hierarchy is flipped. The most victimized are at the top. White men are at the bottom. It's a mirror image of what's going on the other side of the aisle. And the Jews have no place in either of these systems. I have been fighting the anti-Semitism of the left, the anti-Semitism that it is harder for us to recognize because it cloaks itself in the language of progressive values since I was 18 years old and walked onto campus at Columbia University. I have been called an unhinged Zionist, a neoconservative, a neo-McCarthyite, the leading edge of white supremacy, you name it, for standing up for Israel and against those on the left who want to see the Jewish state destroyed. I write in the New York Times about the viciousness of Louis Farrakhan and his disturbing relationship between him and the leaders of the Women's March. No one can accuse me of being soft on the left. But the urgent issue this morning is the anti-Semitism of the political right. What happened in Pittsburgh did not happen in a vacuum. You need only to think of last year's chants of Jews will not replace us in Charlottesville, or the president's constant attacks on globalists, international bankers, and the corrupt media, all of which are commonly associated with Jews in the minds of anti-Semites. It isn't at all surprising that these rhetorical tropes have translated into acts of violence. According to the ADL, anti-Semitic incidences rose 57% in 2017. Now let's remember what anti-Semitism is. It's not just a prejudice, it's a conspiracy theory. What anti-Semitism says is that there is a secret hand controlling the world, and is controlling the world at our expense, and that secret hand has a name, and that name is the Jew. Now, I don't think that Donald Trump is an anti-Semite, but one of the reasons that people like David Duke and Richard Spencer and others are drawn to Trump's banner is that they recognize him as a conspiracy theorist. Trump calls it money, power, and globalism. What the Richard Spencers of the world hear is Jew, Jew, Jew. I believe that the president is inculcating a kind of embrace of conspiracy theory on the right that has inevitably led us to this moment. This poison is now in the mainstream. Yesterday on Fox, the head of a group called Judicial Watch referred to the Soros-occupied State Department. The House Majority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, put out a tweet saying that George Soros, Tom Steyer, and Michael Bloomberg were buying this year's elections. I could literally go on all morning with examples just from yesterday. I support the embassy move to Jerusalem. I agree that the Iran deal was terrible. But liking and even applauding aspects of this administration's policies should not blind us to the fact that rhetoric has consequences. And not everyone has gotten the memo to take Trump seriously, but not literally. The second way I think we can respond is less political and more civic. We can model what our leaders refuse to. I was speaking yesterday to one of my dearest friends in Jerusalem. It was a very odd reversal. I'm used to calling him to see if everything's okay, and all of a sudden he and others were calling me. We were talking about the nature of violence in Israel and in the States. In Israel, he suggested, the attacks feel like they are part of a struggle for the Jewish people to live free in the state of Israel. He said that during the Second Intifada years, when bombs were blowing up in restaurants and buses, Israelis viewed just going about their daily business, commuting, shopping, going on a date, as part of the struggle for Israel's very survival. They refused to let their enemies conquer the joy of living and of being free. This imputes meaning to each victim of what, on the face of it, is senseless violence. They are part of a struggle to declare a public space as civilized, as a home, when attackers want it to be seen as a forbidding war zone. This creates meaning in their deaths. As we talked, he wondered out loud, how do you make meaning out of the face of this senseless death in Pittsburgh? Is this violence in any way part of a broader struggle? And if so, a struggle for what? He answered his own question by saying, innocent Jews who are gunned down are part of a broader, albeit a quieter struggle, by living their lives in a profoundly decent, big-hearted, and tolerant way. Here were people descended from immigrants who built a model in America of living that repudiates the monoculture that today's radical right and radical left wish to promulgate. In simply going about their lives, they served as unknowing flag bearers of what we aspire to see in societies around the world: tolerance, community, care, and kindness. In the simplicity of their lives, they realized the aspiration of millions around the world of places like Syria and Yemen. The idea that these simple shul goers are in a global battle for goodness right now tells you everything about the state of our world. But they are, and it is, and we can't wait for our leaders. We have to live that way. Now, what is the Jewish response to this moment? Judaism does not allow us to give in to despair, just the opposite. As Rabbi Jonathan Sachs has beautifully written, Judaism is a faith for those who seek to change the world. That is unusual in the history of faith, he writes. Most religions are about coming to accept the world the way that it is. But Judaism is a protest against the world that is, in name of the world that ought to be. I want to say that again, because I screwed it up. Judaism is a protest against the world that is, in name of the world that ought to be. To be a Jew is to seek to make a difference, to change lives for the better, and to heal some of the scars of our fractured world. JNF knows that better than most. What did Karen Kayemet L'Israel originally do? It made the desert bloom. It didn't make it bloom by despairing, by standing there and cursing that the state of Israel was located in a barren desert. It did it by planting, by building, by nurturing ancient Jewish roots in the form of new trees, new life, and new communities. We need to do that building and nurturing in our community, in our Jewish community all over the world, and especially here at home right now. We're going to do it by following a more than 2,000-year-old game plan that these days feels almost radical. We're going to do it by wearing our kippot and our Magen Davids proudly in public. We are going to show up at shul in droves, even those of us like me who don't usually show up on a Shabbat morning. We're going to play basketball at our JCCs. We're going to watch Israeli films and listen to Israeli music and book trips to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem just for fun. We're going to give tzedakah, and I'm starting with Hayas. We're going to sit Shiva, and then we're going to have a l'chaim. We are going to practice real Ahavat Yisrael, and we're going to practice Tikkun Olam, not in the pat, empty way, but in the real way. We are going to practice a Judaism of affirmation, not a Judaism of defensiveness. And we are going to tell our story, the epic story of the history of our people and our state. What is the probability that the people of Israel, driven, as Moshe put it, out to the farthest parts under heaven, would in fact come back to their ancient land from the corners of the earth after thousands of years of exile, of persecution, of destruction, and of near elimination in the fires of Europe? What is the probability that in a matter of decades, a country of 600,000 would grow to become the place called home by more Jews than any other country in the world? What is the likelihood that the language of the Bible would be revived, modernized, and used by politicians and prostitutes alike? And what is the likelihood that you and I would be alive for the Jewish return to political sovereignty? It is an earthly miracle, one just as amazing as the parting of the Red Sea. We should be telling our story especially to the younger generation. We should be telling a story, as my friend Liel Leibowitz recently wrote in Tablet, about the millennia that preceded Auschwitz, about the temples and the exiles and the intellectuals and the deep and immovable roots that bind us to the land and from which Jewish self-determination had bloomed for thousands of years. We should be telling them a story about Zionism that is deep and broad enough to explain why the Jews of Ethiopia walked for weeks through the jungle and the desert in a modern exodus to try and reach Zion. Jews who had never heard of the Holocaust until they got to the Holy Land. And we should be telling a story full of depth and pride. We should not shy away from that line about the Jewish people being a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Yes, that means that we shoulder all kinds of responsibilities and burdens, but it also means that we are part of a chain of history going back thousands of years. Don't dumb it down. Young people are moved by big things. Big ideas changed my life, and nothing has been more powerful in my life than feeling like I am part of the Jewish story, a tiny link in the history of my people. So we will build a Jewish people and a Jewish state and a Jewish future that are not only safe and resilient, but self-aware, meaningful, generative, humane, and life-affirming. A Judaism capable of, to borrow a powerful image from Chabad, lighting the lamp in every Jewish soul and of all of those who throw in our lot with us. The killer in Pittsburgh insisted that all Jews must die. To him, we in this room, and we outside of this room, the luckiest Jews in human history, respond in unison, Am Yisrael Chai. Thank you. Thank you.